Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. Our Slapped and Carbon Bros seasons have wrapped, and we'll be bringing you a new season later this month. In the meantime, we have a whole bunch of interviews to bring you, starting with this great conversation our Australia reporter Royce Kermelovs had last month with Brown University professor Mark Blythe on what he calls the strategy of carbon dominance and how we're seeing that strategy play out in an all-out attack on renewable energy in the US and beyond. I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much for being here to talk to me about this. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation for some time after I caught your talk at the London School of Economics about carbon dominance, where you described the politics of climate change and you put it through the lens of both carbon and power. Would you mind walking us through what is the strategy of carbon dominance?
So essentially, carbon dominance is what I would call what's going on in the United States just now, and that requires a little bit of unpacking. So you can focus on the politics, and obviously it's Trump, obviously it's MAGA, obviously it's right-wing populism, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also something weird going on in all this, you probably noticed. Like yesterday, when the EU basically said, yes, please, to a 15% tax on everything they do, he then went on this really weird rant about, and the one thing that I'll do my Trump, and the one thing we'll never do is build a windmill. The EU will have no windmills in America. And he starts going on this whole thing about windmills. And it's just, you think it's bizarre. You've got hatred against windmills, but it's actually far deeper than that. And the short version of the story goes like this. Where does populism and Trump and all this stuff come from? Why does it have an anti-carbon twinge? So two things. One is basically what you might call the strategic power side of this. We'll park that for a minute, but let's come back to it. What's the domestic politics of this? Go back to 1975, and the three biggest employers in the United States were, if I remember correctly, General Motors, the company that became Exxon, and another big manufacturer. I can't remember who the hell it was. Now, you go to today, and what do you get? You basically, your top three are Walmart, the Home Depot, and Amazon Logistics. So they've gone from a business model for a country that makes lots of things to ones that sells lots of things, lots of which is made in other places. And this is the whole deindustrialization thing and China shock and so on and so forth, right? And I go back to about 1971, just before that period. And what have you got? You've got kind of an encompassing political coalition whereby 1 in 5 jobs is in the auto sector and 1 in 3 are in related sectors that feed into this. So what does politics look like in this period? It looks like Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Every political scientist in the world will be writing about how there's no difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. They agree on everything. So what are they doing? They're basically arguing over the distributions within what we would call a stable growth model. And what was that growth model? It was a carbon-based growth model. What powered American growth for the 19th century, for the 20th century, particularly post-war, is the East Texas Basin. It's cheap fuel. It's basically having cheap fuel, which powers cheap electricity, where you can produce at scale, manufacturing, so on and so forth. So you have this very sort of encompassing coalition. Everybody's basically part of the same growth model. 30% of people are working in unions, as an industrial economy, etc. Move forward through the 80s, the 90s, into the China shock, the 2000s. And what have you got? You got a Republican coalition that looks like this. Start in Alaska, go to North Dakota, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Kansas, East Texas, through the Panhandle, Mississippi, Alabama, come up to West Virginia. What have you got? You got the core of the Republican states, the reddest states. What do they all do? They're the residual from that old growth model. They're the carbon coalition. What they do is food, farms, fuel, fertilizer, feedstock, plastics, petrochemicals, manufacturing. That's their core business model. So when Biden comes along and says, we're going to do decarbonization, they regard this as an existential threat to their growth model because basically they're going to shut them down. And you can tell them all the stories about we're going to help you transit and all this sort of stuff, but they basically look at the Midwest and go, nah, we don't believe you. We'll stick with ours. This is basically an existential struggle. Now, park that for a second and then think about how we used to think about stranded assets. Stranded assets was something that would happen to carbon assets because as the world got warmer and as governments got serious about climate change, they would tighten, if you will, the regulations, and it become too expensive to have these things or produce these things. And companies would rationally disinvest from them, and investors would disinvest from them, and they would become stranded assets, and therefore nobody would want to hold them. And that's how you basically power a transition towards green tech, et cetera, et cetera. But what if you flip that on its head and you say that there's an existential struggle between green and carbon asset, and we now hold the White House and the Senate and the House? So what are we going to do? Well, basically, we're going to protect our assets. So how do you do that? You dominate the other sectors. Yeah, we're not going to ban it completely. We're going to get rid of all the subsidies. We're going to get rid of any scientific support. We're going to lean into all the stuff that doesn't really matter. For example, last week was the pitch that the American government's no longer going to recognize greenhouse gases in any way harmful. Been lots of other things like this. But essentially what they're doing is they've got a strategy of, we're going to allow you to build that windmill in Texas because that'll help us keep the air conditioning on. But in no way do you replace the carbon that's powering the economy. And moreover, that's where we get the power stuff. Go back to the power stuff we parked a while ago. That has been the secret to American growth. Partly it's the dollar, which I'm happy to talk about, but the dollar very much rises and falls historically with the price of oil. Because even though Saudi for a while was the biggest producer and America is now the largest net producer, it's American oil companies, it's American LNG, it's a huge part of what America does. And it also gives them a huge advantage in growth. So, for example, the cost of energy in the United States is approximately 1/3 the cost of what it is in the United Kingdom. So if you have that as your advantage and you basically are part of that coalition that sees carbon as basically your strategic advantage, when the rest of the world is decarbonizing, you have two choices. You can either go for splendid hemispheric isolation from Greenland to Argentina based on carbon, which might be one option. Or you can do what they're also doing, which is actively discourage through a coercion and bribery and other methods to do with tariffs and others, to get others not to make a green transition and instead to sign very long contracts for American LNG, et cetera, et cetera. So carbon dominance is basically when you turn stranding assets into a political strategy. And that is essentially what's going on right now.
So I think the phrase is essentially you're trying to drown the competitive industry that is green tech, that is, renewables, solar, wind. You're trying to drown the baby in the bathtub before it becomes established, before it becomes a threat.
Correct.
And so just to go back to what you said about the tariffs, I mean, the tariffs have been integral to Trump's strategy in this, trying to erect that tariff wall, in their view, it seems, to rebuild American industry.
Mm-hmm.
How is that playing into this broader strategy? Because as the narrative goes, tariffs are a profound act of self-harm.
Well, are they, right? In the sense that the problem with thinking about tariffs is it always has this, the economist caveat on it, which is ceteris paribus, all things remaining equal. But they're never equal. So if you think about the fact that corporate profits, particularly American profits, but everybody's profits have never been higher, if you throw up tariffs, do you think those companies can eat that a little bit while reducing their margins? Yes. In other words, things don't remain equal. So some of it will end up on the American consumer, some of it will end up in producers. You'll be able to effectively tax those producers and then redistribute that cash. They've already raised a couple of $100 billion with it. It's not exactly chump change. In terms of the broader strategy, will a 15% tariff lead to American reindustrialization? No. Would a 50% tariff? Well, yeah, because you'd stop trading and therefore you would literally have to make the stuff yourself. So on its own, as a reindustrialization vehicle, absence any sense of investment policy or industrial policy, which you had with Biden, then it's probably not going to work. But nonetheless, does it sort of work in terms of a political strategy? Yes. If you think about the 19th century, what was the Republican policy towards the working class to protect them? The tariff. Keep out foreign competition, have ruthless domestic competition, keep your markets really flexible, keep your energy costs really, really low. In fact, use carbon to make them the lowest in the world. Never mind all this stuff about the levelized cost of electricity being cheaper with green stuff. If we really pump enough carbon, we can be competitive. And we can do that in such a way that we can ignore and basically obviate this green transition.
I want to move now to kind of the picture beyond the US for a moment. But there was something you mentioned in your talk, the London School of Economics, which was a lot of this stuff works around the idea of, I think you used the phrase minimum viable coalitions.
Yeah, minimum winning coalitions, yeah.
Yes. So what is that, just to be clear about what that is?
Sure. So the basic, if you think about politics under that old regime I talked about, when Democrats were Tweedledum and the Republicans were Tweedledee, how did you win elections? That's when political science was in love with a thing called median voter theorem. So there's some dude who's in the middle, and they really have middle preferences. And because votes are very large number things, ultimately you have a kind of quasi-normal distribution of preferences, which is to say there are very few communists and very few fascists, and most people are just Uncle Nice in the middle. So you need to move your policy towards capturing as many Uncle Nice as possible. And the Republicans will do it by saying, hey, tax cuts are good for Uncle Nice. And then Democrats will say, no, actually, redistribution is really good for Uncle Nice, and that's what we should do. But essentially, Tweedledum and Tweedledee fought over this median voter. The median voter has largely disappeared. What you've basically got are the action is no longer in a sort of normal distribution. What you've got are very heterogeneous preferences. And what you try and do is build a minimum winning coalition rather than an encompassing coalition. You basically go to your base and work out from the tail to as far into the middle as you need to go, basically working with your activists, working with gerrymandering districts, working with keeping them agitated and angry all the time. And in that way, the Republicans have been much more successful than the Democrats. And it's that ability to build that minimum winning coalition, keep that going, means that you don't have to compromise anything with the other side.
So taking those ideas, something I was picking up in my reporting in isolation was that there have been attempts elsewhere to replicate this strategy. I mean, we see this kind of in New Zealand where the government's coupled together. We see this in Australia with different Australian states, like Queensland now is currently doing something similar. And also it looks like the UK might be going down that path.
Yeah.
And so my question is, how do we see this kind of spooling out from the US to other places right now?
Well, there's a way in which it doesn't work, which is if you really want to destroy a right-wing political movement, just get endorsed by Trump. So, that's what Albanese showed us. That's what Canada showed us, right? I mean, that was basically like Trump comes out for the other guy and it's a kiss of death. On the other hand, there are deep sort of endogenous reasons for these countries to embrace this type of politics. So what is this type of politics? This type of politics basically says three things. There's a self-serving elite called the top 10 to 20%. They've run off with all the cash. We've got nothing. And screw them. They hate us. And that's it, basically. There's one is basically, then there's a sort of nationalist, ethno-nationalist version of that. It's the anti-immigration thing. It's basically all these foreigners coming in and living off welfare and we're the one paying taxes, so on and so forth. And then there's the anti-green one, right? It's all a hoax and we don't need to do this. And those different factions coalesce because all of those are basically, whether they're legitimate grievances or not, I'll leave up to whoever's listening to this, but they work together as a set. And they're all real things in each of these countries. Is it the case that basically, in the eyes of many, a self-serving political elite that cares more about decarbonization than the fact that your kids' school's falling down? Yes. What about wage stagnation? Well, it hasn't happened for the top 20%. It's happened for everyone else. They don't seem to give a damn about us. Yes, right? So those conditions are there. And what Trump has done is to provide a model of how to do this, of what this is and what these agents should be thinking about, etc. And they'll have different national cadences and different national flavors, but the formula is essentially the same. So we have this world in which those grievances have real valence, if you will, for people. They mobilize around them. To a certain extent, the United States provides a template for it, but you have to then dial it back in terms of the particularities of your local economy, etc. You can't just take these ideas off the shelf and dump them down and do the playbook. They have to be played with in certain ways. And then there's the figure of Trump himself, who is immensely unpopular outside of the United States and actually inside the United States. So that kind of cuts the other way. But, that's sort of the broad way in which I think about it.
So when we're thinking about this as kind of international conservatism, we may find parallels between places like Hungary, the US, and other places around. But ultimately, these are American ideas and they don't necessarily transplant as easily to other countries, other communities, other places.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about Hungary, right? I mean, Orban's big thing, along with a lot of the sort of nationalist right in Eastern Europe, it began with central banks. It began basically as central banks as agents of the money lenders and all of the anti-Semitic tropes that went with that, the sort of the anti-Soros thing, etc. Then it became sort of, along with Putin, the much more nationalist version of this. Hungary then became very critical of the EU and then the ethno-nationalism, etc., etc. So there's a playbook which is developed very much uniquely in those places, and it predates Trump. But what Trump did was basically take this kind of latent coalition of basically angry working class people and lower middle class people who'd been hit by a combination of financial crisis, austerity, wage stagnation, and a seeming favoritism towards foreigners rather than the domestic population. And he was able to weaponize that, and that's been layered on top of those politics in other places. So again, to think of, the Le Pen's very different. The National Front's very different to this. They've tacked very much towards the center to be left economically, but right on immigration, etc. It's quite different from the MAGA approach. Vox in Spain, very much more like the MAGA approach. Reform, it's really kind of a vehicle for Farage rather than anything else. So there's a Trumpy aspect to this, but the politics aren't particularly MAGA in that respect. So again, it's a very mixed bag. What's interesting is at this moment, you see this everywhere in different versions, and it behooves us to go, well, why?
One of the questions I had was, so we have this kind of international conservatism building. We have this template being set up by Trump and his friends. We also have this strategy of carbon dominance that we've outlined. But opposed to that, we have the example apparently being set by China, where China is moving very fast to, I think in May, it installed Sweden's worth of solar. It's, peak oil is expected in China by 2027. I could have that wrong. But we're starting to see, kind of incredible statistics coming out about, the rate of EV production, solar panels.
Of like 11 and 15 sectors, all the rest of it, absolutely.
And then we had the UN Secretary General just the other day released that report basically saying, hey, solar is still the cheapest thing ever and batteries are coming down and everything's changing now. So when we view what's going on in the US in opposition to China, what are we looking at?
So this is where you move out to the other side of Trump's circle, away from the national conservatives, the Bannon wing, the Marjorie Taylors, and you move away from the finance people who are interested in stable coins and sort of reworking the role of the dollar. And you get back to those folks that used to be mainstream Republicans, the ones that are like Marco Rubio. And you say, well, what do they worry about? What they worry about is China. And they worry about China in the following sense. They are, if you will, and my friend and colleague Dan Driscoll must get a shout out for this because he's writing an op-ed on this and I just read it, so it's in my head. But essentially, I think Dan's right on this. That group of people are what you might call really hardcore foreign policy realists. And they're a very materialistic bunch of realists in the sense that they've got no time for America as the shining light on the hill or any of that sort of stuff. This is naked self-interest. And what does naked self-interest dictate? History is written by the people who control the source of energy. The 19th century, it was coal. That was the United Kingdom with a technological lead. Once it moved to oil and gas, it became the United States. Russia was able to maintain itself in large part through the Cold War because it was completely self-sufficient in oil and gas. And if you control that stuff, then you control the future. But if you've got a world in which greenhouse gases and other warming agents are seriously threatening everything from biowebs to human survival, then you have to decarbonize. Now, whoever gets there first, whoever locks that in, whoever creates the tech, they're the ones that are going to be the next hegemon. They're the ones that are going to be selling the stuff you need to survive to everybody else. And Biden's crew recognized this and had they won the election, their idea would have been IRA 2, IRA 3, build on this, build more and more, actually get ahead of the technological curve, try and sort of anticipate before China gets there where to go. And instead, what we did was we voted in Trump and we basically said to the tech lords, why don't you just do AI instead? Because I'm sure it'll end up being something someday. So that's kind of where it's ended up. And we've ceded that to China. Now, if you cede that to China and you're a foreign policy realist, what do? You have to stop them. This is why they're serious about Taiwan. This is why they're not spoiling for a fight, quite willing to have one. Now, the interesting thing about the Trump coalition is these people are quite vocal and quite a prominent part of it. But so far, they seem to be completely sidelined because neither the tech laws nor the national conservatives really want to get to a shooting war with China. They're quite fine to have the Communist Party as the ideological enemy and so on and so forth. And they're pushing green tech around the world and it's all just bullshit and we shouldn't be doing it. Why don't you love our coal industry, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't really want to get into a shooting match that could be the final shooting match. So there's real tensions in this coalition, but the basic idea is whoever controls the energy infrastructure of the 21st century runs the world. And the Americans are very scared that it's not going to be oil and gas, and they're doing everything they can to make sure that it is.
Well, on that, in terms of material reality that this is describing here, one of the things that is very interesting to me is you have China. I think there was a report out yesterday, the day before, that China is now basically planning to eliminate its oil imports. At the same time, you have Japan basically buying more gas than what it needs now that its nuclear is coming back on and reselling Australian gas while it's on the water. You have Pakistan doing the same thing, and Pakistan's Southeast Asian economy, considered to be one that was going to be growth, is now leapfrogging over kind of carbon assets, just solar. You have China supplying EVs to Africa, so you have the potential for a leapfrog effect there. So in combination with kind of the US tariffs that may drive up prices of steel and steel labor and the anti-immigration policies that compromise your ability to do skills, and the reality that there are going to be a lot less people buying this stuff down the track, where does that leave the US in terms of the material reality?
This is where the story falls apart, because at the end of the day, the problem is we have too much carbon. We have too many carbon assets. If you start to think about the basal salt fields that you've got off of Argentina, off of Brazil, Indonesia, Guyana, as well as the LNG that you're talking about, Qatar, all these other places, there's too much of this stuff. Now, from the one hand, you could imagine an argument that would say, well, that's fine, because ultimately we are the swing producer. Saudi will still have the lowest possible price, highest possible quality, but they can't do everything. There's going to be a bunch of stuff we can't decarbonize in any conceivable time frame, such as air, travel, and so on and so forth. Cement's a bit of a tough one. So we're still going to be able to do that. And if prices fall, that's great, because that gives us a way of staying in the game vis-a-vis these alternative green technologies. But ultimately, if it becomes so cheap that you can't really make a profit out of it, right? Ultimately, the capex is bigger than the opex, then you've got a bit of a problem. And ultimately, that thing that usually kills green transitions or experimental technologies, the valley of death between basically piloting and then getting it to scale and then making some money off of it. You get a weird version of that whereby what's the point in opening up another fracking field in Oklahoma if at the end of the day, the world price is $20 because everything's so saturated? So in a sense, it's sort of double-edged. You want the cheapness, it keeps you in the game, but if it gets too cheap, you knock out your own producers. And also, at the end of the day, if it is the case that battery technology gets better, et cetera, and China strategically just doesn't want to deal with the vulnerabilities that come with oil, and India also falls very much into this category. India's neuralgia has always been oil imports and the ability to pay for them. So if you get India, Pakistan, China, the rest of Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia, Indonesia, making a green transition, the Americans, unfortunately, they are going to be the last people hanging around driving F-150s that cost $200,000.
One final question, and something I wanted to ask, because I feel like it's always left out of these analysis. What do you see as the role of, what is called greenflation? The price of stuff rising as climatic patterns change and things become more variable and you've got disasters. It is something that seems to be universally recognized that climate change will drive up the cost of stuff over time. But and we also know, we can look at the Biden administration where inflation spikes kind of become the mandate of heaven, where if it spikes, you lose government pretty quickly. And as you say, I think you've got a very good phrase to this, nature always bats last. And so if we're seeing this as an inevitability, how does that figure into this politics as a factor?
So if you had Biden administration 2.0 that was continuing down this path, you would take a leaf out of Isabella Weber's book, you would build up buffer stocks, you would try and think about things that you would need to have strategic supplies of so you could release them if there were shocks, etc. But the problem with that is he didn't win the election. And the second thing is buffer stocks are really expensive. You could be doing something else with the money and that might not be the thing that you run out of. So what is there to do? Well, ultimately what you try and do with these things is to have options in the sense of optionality. You want to cover your downside as much as you can and then position yourself in such a way that you might get the upside on it if it comes to pass. What might that look like? Well, in terms of, let's say, agriculture in the United States, absolutely the case that some places are becoming too hot for particular strands of wheat. Okay, so what do? You move the wheat production elsewhere and you start to do something else in that place. You plan ahead. You try and get ahead of the curve. Is that a foolproof solution to this? Absolutely not. We already have estimates from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research on greenflation. I think it's already significant. There's a recent European report that essentially said it's showing up already. It takes about 60 days from a weather shock to basically show up in food prices. So as these patterns continue, The problem is the non-linearity in them. You don't know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen and which part of the bioweb is going to be impacted. It becomes very difficult to cover that with any type of options. So there's no great solution to it, and it's baked into the cake. What does this do to politics? I think it's already there in the sense that for a couple of years, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you couldn't respectably stand up and say, unless you just wanted to be a crank, that windmills were evil. And then there was a period whereby you had people like the head of the AFD railing against windmills, and somehow this was okay. It was like green fatigue or something like this. I think now in Europe, when every summer is hotter than the prior one, when there are wildfires in Scotland, which never, ever happens, right? When people's actual experience is finally, oh, it's getting really hot in here, isn't it? And none of us have air conditioning. I think that tempers down the absurd claims of anti-climate action and basically allows us to refocus. So I think that sort of, at the end of the day, what's the phrase? Nothing gets your attention better than pain, right? That, there is something to that, and it has a way of filtering out the politics. Quite how Trump deals with this, we don't know. I mean, you don't know if he's going to be done by the midterms. You don't know if he's going to be 2 terms. If the Democrats are the shambles that they are just now and continue to be so, the problem being that as the party of the status quo, who kind of likes things the way they are, it's very hard for them to argue for anything else, that just hands it in a sense to the Republicans. And if we get 2 terms of these guys, then that's when you get the full carbon dominance strategy. And by that point, you'll have seen such a big break with China, the rest with East Asia, with South Asia. And the world will be very much 2 different places. One that's still holding on to carbon, trying to promote its use, and one that's basically post-carbon.
So essentially that model locks.
Yeah, it's path dependent. If the Democrats came back in on a landslide and were able to get 2 back-to-back victories and were able to do a whole restoration of green industrial policy, the damage that these people have done in the meantime is so large. Think about it from the point of view of basic R&D. You're threatening top universities with funding. You're threatening them with withdrawing students. You're banning F1 visas for your top researchers. You're basically saying, we don't care about this stuff. So if you're one of those researchers, one of those scientists, why would you want to be here, particularly if all the action's somewhere else? There's a way in which they're embedding policies, which even if you get a change of administration, it's very hard to undo. The trust is gone.
It's funny you say that, and not to get too parochial, but a lot of the stuff that's happening with Trump makes me sometimes think, and this is unscientific, but about like what's happening in the US is the Australianization of US politics, because we went through a similar period with this in 2013 with the election of Tony Abbott and the Razor gang that came through and just hacked the budget, right, and just cut everything to pieces. And the decisions that were made then had profound changes, and as you described, locked in a series of policies, but that continued to exist for the decade over 3 different coalition administrations. And what it seems to be, the response from the center left, which is Labour Party here, sought to essentially wait them out. And the approach seemed to have been, we're going to present the reasonable, the sensible response to this. When all this fizzles out, we'll be able to step into the breach, promise to rebuild. And the first term of the Albanese administration was very much just about repairing, was about putting back things. And which has left a lot of people very jaded and frustrated in many ways about kind of where things are going. And I wonder whether the Democrats are essentially playing the same strategy, wait this out.
I think some of them would like to wait it out, but the problem is, if you have someone that's in power, like, before the Razor gang, you had Howard as well, who, was not exactly a shining example of public investment. When you've had that degree of damage, you do have to spend a lot of time doing repair. And it's a bit where it's kind of obvious to everyone that this is wrong, and it's okay to go and do that stuff. Britain finds itself in a really weird position because that's exactly where they are with the 13 years of the Conservatives. But the government is so afraid of its own fiscal shadow and so timid that they literally are hamstrung not by anything except their own fear of the bond market. The bond market itself is not the problem. They're just afraid of it. So they are unable to do it, and that really gets people pissed off and jaded. I suspect that what's happening in Australia is where the Democrats would like to find themselves. That is to say, we would be back in power, we would be credible, people would recognize the damage. I don't think America's there yet. I think a lot of people don't think at all that this is damage. They think this is what we need to do. There is a certain logic to it. If you basically are a kind of realist in the international relations sense, and you think the most important thing isn't how the global welfare optimum is generated, you think it's how America does, and America should be running things, then a strategy of carbon dominance and at least hemispheric dominance would make sense to you. And allowing China to run off with everything is not what you want. So it depends what you value at the end of the day.
And Mark, before I let you go, we've talked about many things today, but is there anything else you think we've missed or you want to highlight or bring out in this conversation?
I think it's a really interesting one is to think about the fact that while China continues to basically dominate sector after sector to invest in battery technology, etc., they've got an approach to AI, but they're not betting the farm on it. And the United States is betting the farm on it. And this is very different from what you usually do. Usually what the United States does is run a kind of hidden developmental state through universities, through agencies like DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects. And then, we make these things and then they spill out into the private sector. And the great example is Mariana Mazzucato did this in her book on the competition state. All the key technologies in the iPhone were basically made in public and private universities with federal money. And they had defense applications. And then Steve comes along, puts it in a shiny box and changes the world, right? And this is very different. This is now where we've got these massive companies whose investment budgets are orders of magnitude bigger than anything that the universities could muster or even the public sector would put out. And they're run by man-children with massive egos. So if you think about Meta, Meta has squandered almost $1 trillion on the metaverse. It's just bollocks, right? So
and they can't produce legs.
No, exactly. And you've got, so you have this sort of, incredible arms race for this thing called generative AI, which is never going to happen. It's a complete chimera. You don't get it's almost a very Soviet way of thinking. It's like, if we have enough of a quantity of transformation, you get a quality of transformation. It's like, no, that's not how it happens. But nonetheless, we'll spend all this money on this sort of stuff in this insane arms race. And then the people at the top still can't tell you what the final use case is. Meanwhile, China's just going sector after sector. Let's do batteries. Let's do this. Let's do this. It really is this strange moment where the cult of the entrepreneur in the United States has blinded the country to what actually we need to do in long-term investment. And we've bet the house all on this one critical technology, which as far as I'm concerned, all it seems to be able to do is to bugger up higher education and people's ability to write things. So, that would be my side worry on top of all this stuff.
But there's an aspect to that where the use of AI appears, if we look at this in terms of power, I've written about this actually for Drilled, where there is an extension to which AI is the next link in the evolutionary train from the way economic modeling was used to argue against doing anything about climate change, which was another Australian pioneering invention, by the way. You can see how, the hype and the focus on artificial intelligence as a climate solution and it will fix everything, it will create new materials, is very much a distraction and a very convenient way to turn people away from investing in and focusing on, to just going all in on, wind, solar, batteries, everything.
Figure out sodium batteries, you get rid of the need for thermal protection, the cost of EVs dropped by 30%. It's very simple. It's not nearly as sexy as we're making God in a box.
And with that might be a good point to end on. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time today.
We're making God in a box.